Hi, everybody. This is David Blinken and my co-conspirator, Luyen. Anyway, we want to thank everybody for joining us. This is our first installment of Masters of the Fly for 22, and we're very honored for all of you to join us. We have a really great presentation tonight from the American Saltwater Guides Association. Um, and just to remember, Masters of the Fly is not about mastery. We are really a community. It's a shared passion among people um, who have the same interests as us and the same concerns. And, it's just a wonderful, passionate pursuit that we all share in common. First and foremost, I'd like to thank all you attendees for coming here tonight. It's a great privilege. I'd like to thank the Masters of the Fly planning group. You guys, without you guys, we couldn't get this going. I'd like to thank the American Saltwater Guides Association. You guys are a guest tonight, and it's a big help to have you guys explain what's gonna go down tonight. Tail Magazine, thank you. Trout Unlimited, you'll be seeing us there very soon. And we'd also like to thank Dunn Magazine, who is going to be participating coming up in some future events. Lou?
Hey, thanks, David, and thanks all of you for being here tonight. Obviously, big thank you to the American Saltwater Guides Association. I mean, wow, what a journey from when this little organization started a few years ago to today. So, super excited for Tony and Wooly today to talk to all of us about what's been going on in 21 and sort of culminated this last week with the ASMFC hearings. Big thanks to Captain John McMurray, obviously, for starting this crazy little endeavor and for being such a friend to all of us as fishermen in this community. Um, uh, Peter Jenkins, the board chair for ASCA and the head of Saltwater Edge, thank you for everything you've done. Captain Peter Fallon, who's done a great job of helping to promote this session and really being a friend to ASCA and a big resource. John Papsiak, who runs Northeast Saltwater Fly Fishing
Thank you,
group on
John.
Facebook. Thank you, John, for all your help. Jerry Audette in Deep Outdoors, and everyone else who helped to promote this event. I wanted to just, you can see on David's background, but Tom, if you can just put up real quick the upcoming events. We've got an incredible series of events this winter. Please, subscribe, register on Masters of the Fly. They're all free. They're all on Sunday evenings. Next Sunday, we have the legendary Bob Popovics with Johnny King. It's going to be an amazing, amazing event for anyone who's a fly tyer and a fly fisherman. Just to hear from Bob and Johnny about their approach to fly tying will be an incredible experience. But an incredible lineup this winter. But again, thank you to all of you for being part of it. And with that, really just want to sort of hand this over to I guess one other thing I want to say is one thing that you can all do to help. You're all obviously supporters of our conservation work that's been led by the American Saltwater Guides Association. We will put the link. Actually, Tom just put it in the chat. If you can all, see fit to make a donation to ASCA, we would really appreciate it. These events are free, so consider it a small price of admission for a great series of free events. But please contribute to ASCA. It's an incredible organization, and we really count on your support.
Yeah,
Yeah,
these donations aren't looked at. It doesn't matter if it's $1 or $100. It really is very important to further the protection of our waters that we all love very much, and we
that's
want
right.
to, the resource is too important to take for granted.
That's right. Thank you. And so, just a little bit of housekeeping here. In your Zoom screen, you should see at the bottom of the screen a set of icons. You'll see a raise hand and a Q&A and a chat. right? So click on the chat and use the chat if you want to talk amongst yourselves, if you have a thought that you want to share. Use the Q&A button if you have a question. We're going to leave a good 20 plus minutes for Q&A with Tony and Willie tonight. So put your questions in there. We'll moderate them. We'll make sure we get to as many as we can. If you want to ask a question live, hit the raise hand button and we'll put you on the screen. We are also recording all of this, and it'll be posted both on our Facebook page, Masters of the Fly, on Facebook, and then also on our YouTube channel. So just be aware that this is being recorded and will be posted on those two venues for posterity. And then with that, I just want to introduce our good friend and fellow Master of the Fly, Eric Shatsker, who will be our moderator tonight, as he was all through last season. Eric, let me turn it over to you.
And thank you, Eric.
Tom is actually asking if the video is frozen for anyone else. Are we having any issues with? We are not, Tom. So I think it may be on your side, but if others are finding the videos frozen, let us know. But with that, let me turn it over to Eric.
Thanks, Lilian. Thank you, David. I'm thrilled to be back here with Masters of the Fly for 2022 season. It's an honor, honestly, to be associating myself with a series of events featuring some of the sport's greatest innovators, fly tyers, conservationists, and anglers. And on the conservation front, you can't really than our two featured guests tonight. I'd like to introduce Willie Goldsmith, the Executive Director of the American Saltwater Guides Association, and Tony Friedrich, who is the Vice President and Policy Director. And just to frame things for everybody, Willie and Tony, John McMurray's, are really like the Sir Lancelots, Sir Gawains, the Knights of the Round Table, fighting the forces of darkness in the interests of safeguarding the precious resource that we call our fishing stocks. And tonight we're going to spend most of our time talking about striped bass. There'll be an opportunity for those of you who are interested in asking Willie and Tony about some other things to jump in later, but that's where we're going to focus our conversation. And I encourage you to participate. As Luyen said, there's the Q&A box. We really do, I in particular, want to hear from you. And I know Willie and Tony do as well. So please don't be shy. And if you really want to engage with them personally, you can stick up your hand and we'll be able to feature you, but let's save that for a little later in the conversation. But keep the questions flowing. I'll try to work them into the conversation, make everything contextual and flow as best as possible. One of the things that we're obviously dealing with when we talk about policy issues is a little bit of alphabet soup. ASGA is a good start, but then there's the ASMFC as well. And Willie and Tony, Willie, I'll turn it over to you first. You're the executive director. I'd like you to, many people who are in the chat room, as it were, tonight may not have been with us a year ago, aren't familiar with ASGA, don't know what the ASMFC is and why it's such a focus for you and Tony, and frankly, for the rest of us as well. So why don't you start by introducing the work that ASGA does and then talk about the ASMFC and explain what happened last week, which is one of the reasons why we're gathering together with you tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I'm happy to, and thank you, Lou and David, and all of the Masters of the Fly team for having us here tonight. It's always an honor and a great joy to be with you guys. So thanks for letting us be part of the program and share some of the developments that are going on with striped bass, because there's a lot going on. As we'll dig into a bit later, you know, we've really seen the importance of public engagement and really getting people involved, and how that really can move the needle in terms of what options are on the table, and you know, improving the outcome for our fisheries. So just a bit about the American Saltwater Guides Association. We've been around for about 3 years now, and we represent for hire fishing captains and guides, small businesses, tackle manufacturers, and conservation-minded recreational anglers who really take the philosophy that having a lot of fish in the water is really what's best for everybody. An abundant fishery and a healthy fishery is what drives our fishing economy and what promotes healthy ecosystems. So we work to find a balance between sustainable use and allowing for having all of those fish in the water that we all love to catch. That's kind of our driving mission and vision, if you will. And, as we'll get into, striped bass is really one of the, one of our key species, our flagship species, if you will. Certainly something that Tony has been engaged on passionately for many years, as we'll get into in a bit. And kind of where the crux of what happens with striped bass is with the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, or the ASMFC. The ASMFC is an interstate compact of the 15 Atlantic coast states, and basically they all come together and collectively manage fish that generally occur in nearshore waters, so waters that are generally less than 3 miles from the coast. So outside of 3 miles, you have what's called the exclusive economic zone, which are federal waters, which is what is managed by the National Marine Fisheries Service. So we're talking about the state waters here. Of course, striped bass is probably the most well-known species that's managed by the ASMFC, and that's managed by the states from Maine to North Carolina collectively. And they basically decide on decisions collectively with one state per vote, with each state having a delegation of 3 members. So that's kind of a brief rundown as to what we're working with here. The ASMFC is the primary decision-making body when it comes to striped bass conservation. So hopefully that provides a little bit of clarity there. But with that, Eric, I think I'd like to kick it over to Tony. Tony's our policy director. He's unquestionably a striped bass guru and has been following the developments, both the commission and with striped bass management, just about as closely or more closely than anybody else over the past couple of decades. So I think when it comes down to running down what's going on with stripers and what happened last week, I'd love to pass it over to Tony.
Thanks, Willie. First, big kudos to everyone who's listening. Thanks for taking the time to learn a little bit about striped bass. I'm sure a lot of you commented on the public information document. And to kind of set the stage for where we are, there were 9 items in the public information document, 10 if you count other. And right now, we're really only dealing with 4 items. And some of them are actually good. So some of them will actually add conservation to striped bass management if we can push them over the line. So I know it's a frustrating process. I know you don't feel like your voice is ever heard, but it was, and the proof is in the pudding. It's going to be right there in black and white. So Eric, I'll kick it back over to you. I know you got some questions that you want to ask us, but that's who we are. This is me and Willie. Let's get going. Let's learn about striped bass.
Well, let's start with the big picture. I think a lot of people here, pretty much everybody who's in the room with us tonight is here because they care passionately about striped bass. And they've all had a very mixed experience in the 2021 season. There are people who caught lots of fish, and in many cases, lots of big fish, particularly in the New York Bight area in the springtime and late in the season, but there were many anglers out on Long Island and perhaps in the Chesapeake as well who felt like the fish were nowhere to be found. And I think, Tony and Willie, it's probably best for everybody if we begin with your assessment of the state of the stocks, to the degree that we know where we are, or at least you have some tangible or intangible information. There's obviously going to be a lot more forthcoming from the SMFC, but right now, I think people would appreciate your perspective.
Eric, I'll take a shot at it. Willie, follow up if I miss anything, please. So, based on the 2018 stock assessment, which was approved by the Striped Bass Management Board in 2019, last year data on it is 2017. The population of spawning aged females, the SSB, the spawning stock biomass, is 25% below the management threshold. That is not good. In 2017, we were at like 1995 levels of SSB for the coastal stock. So, and by the way, there's like 6 different stocks of striped bass. We're talking about the stock of striped bass, not the Roanoke, Albemarle Sound, not the ones up in Nova Scotia, the striped bass that live here that we catch. So they're at a 25-year low. And when you look at the recruitment, Chesapeake Bay is responsible for at least 65, most likely over 70% of the total striped bass on the coast. We've had the worst 3 years in a row since 1979 through 1981 for spawns. So, where we are, we're lacking data There has not been an update to the stock assessment recently due to COVID, which we totally understand. I mean, how could you do a dockside intercept? So we're expecting that update in October of 2022. That update will contain information, around the poor recruitment, that maybe a little bit extra effort that was exerted during COVID. It'll factor in the new regulations, and that's kind of where we are, and that's a pretty bleak picture. I'll touch on one other thing, and then I'll kick it over to Willie if you don't mind, Eric. Um, you know, there are going to be aggregations of striped bass. You know, it's a shoaling fish. There's usually more than one. So, while big fish may be caught in the spring in the Raritan, everyone knows that's happening. It's a thing of the past in the Chesapeake Bay. And while, there could be good spots along the coast periodically during the migrational runs, I think what you'll find, especially if you talk to surf casters, you talk to small boat guys, it's not really a shadow of what it was. And that doesn't, I'm not suggesting that there still aren't big fish out there to be caught. It's just if you've been fishing for the last 20 years and you look at it coast wide instead of just what's in your backyard, there's no way you can think it's a shadow of what it was in the early 2000s up to like 2006. So Willie, what did I leave out, buddy?
Yeah, just a couple of additional thoughts. I think Tony hit most of the high points there, and I think that last one is a good one. Kind of the shifting baselines, right? Where if you were fishing 20 years ago, what you're seeing right now along the coast is not the same. And the other piece I'd like to add is, there may be a lot of fish in certain areas, kind of pointing to Tony's observation. But what we're hearing from a lot of folks and up and down the coast is they might be seeing a lot of fish, but they're not seeing a lot of variability in the size fish. So we're hearing of a lot of cookie cutter, 2015 year class fish, which I think now are probably around, 20, 26, 28 inches. That's a problem, and it might not seem like a big problem, but one of the things that's really unique about striped bass is Tony mentioned recruitment, which is the number of baby striped bass that are born each year, and that number is not necessarily a function of how many adults there are. It's largely a function of environmental conditions. Thinking about water temperature. You want cold water, you want high flows from lots of rain, and that generally leads to higher striped bass recruitment, which of course is good for the fishery. And the thing about the age structure is when a striped bass spawns is related to how old it is. The larger, older females generally spawn earlier. So if you have a lot of different age structures in the population, you're really hedging your bets around having a successful spawn and having a lot of fish around in the future. So that's just another piece of kind of striped bass biology and how it feeds into the conversation here, and how what folks are seeing on the water, might be indicating a good fishing experience at it, for a given day and a given time. When we're thinking about the long-term outlook for the species, there's definitely a lot to be done, and that's become more and more evident as we continue to hear from folks and our guys out in the water who are having these experiences.
Before we get into the details of what led up to last week's meeting and what transpired at last week's meeting and where things are going from here, I mentioned earlier that I think of you guys, right, as the Knights of the Round Table fighting the forces of darkness. At the risk of being a little bit repetitive, because we did go over some of this last year, it's important though. Could we talk about the forces of darkness? Who are, so to speak, the groups with vested interests in the striper stocks, and how are they positioned against each other? And are any of those positions changing such that maybe some of those groups are beginning to become aligned with one another in the interests of, long-term health and stock management?
Willie kept himself on mute, so I'm gonna take a cue from him and go on ahead and take a swing at this, Eric. Because the commission is an interstate compact, it's a moving target, and a lot of it has to do with who's elected in what state, who they appoint as their fisheries director, who becomes powerful. When a governor changes, a lot of times it makes a huge difference. In some states, it doesn't, because the employees are protected by a union. They're allowed to do science. If it's just whatever, it's the Department of Natural Resources in Maryland. Every state calls it a little something different. So it's a pretty scary thing because you never know when a governor has a lot of control of the Department of Natural Resources. You never know who they're going to put in and what their agenda is going to be. And as an example, many years ago, Maryland probably had one of the best fisheries directors. We didn't deserve the fisheries director that we had. He was excellent. He was fair, and Maryland kind of was known as a conservation state, and very few people remember that now. So it's to answer your question, Eric. Like, who are the forces of darkness? It's just like, I think it's anything else with policy. It's very very small groups that have a very loud voice and are more interested in protecting their piece of the pie than the resource. So, and that's the problem that we run in, because as you know, we're a resource first group and better business through conservation, all that kind of good stuff. So, not to sound too kitschy, but when we're out there, we are trying to be a voice of the resource, and some people are just kind of a voice for their own specific needs.
Willie, do you get the sense that, what we talked about last year, in addition to what Tony said, was, what the commercial fishermen want, what the head boat captains want, what different groups of rec anglers want. And we talked about some of the problems that each of those groups create. Are any of those positions, changing? Have they changed?
I would say that there's definitely been more pressure in some cases from the recreational community, but when it comes to the people who are at the table, the commissioners who have been appointed by the governor or legislative proxies, those really have not changed, and those positions are pretty entrenched. So unless those positions are changing, as Tony was saying, through a changing governor or something like that, there's really, there are opportunities where there's kind of political pressure in that sense, but I think those underlying priorities are not necessarily evolving, particularly at this point. Was that a fair assessment? Would you agree, Tony?
Yeah, and so that's from a commission level. And Eric, if you were talking about other groups out there that are advocating whatever for stripers, none of them, none of the non-recreational groups are organized on a level outside of their state. So in other words, you could have a consortium of commercial fishermen that represent, several ports up and down the coast that all fish for scallop. But in this case, the way that ASMFC is organized, each of those groups that are not in our sector have a tendency to focus mainly on their own state. Right. If that makes
That
any
helps.
sense.
That helps a lot.
Okay.
And let's talk, since we are talking about the ASMFC and how it's, a bunch of different state interests trying with some success occasionally and often without, to come together in a consensus about how to manage the stock. Tony, perhaps you can give us a bit of, set the table, if you will, for the meeting that transpired last week. What was it about? You mentioned earlier how the agenda had shrunk from a list of, say, 9 or 10 items down to 4. What dropped off the list? Why? Willie, I think you talked about how that was somewhat reflective of the input that the commissioners received from people, in many cases, people who are with us tonight.
So I'm gonna try to talk real close. I saw someone come up in the chat. My computer's being a little funky tonight, so hopefully that's better. Feel free to reply in the chat if it's not. So Eric, there were 10 original items in the public information document, and that document is what set the stage for the formal amendment. Public information document is what is and will not be included in the final draft. So there were some really egregious things like changing the reference points, and that's the amount of striped bass that are left in the ocean. If you can't meet water quality standards, lower the standards, and nobody pays attention. And hey, look, I met the standards, right? So you just take that bar and you lower it down for what the striped bass SSB would be. There were other things like the multi-stock model. There was a whole bunch of mess, and I don't want to confuse. Hey, thanks. Good. Thank you, Dave. I appreciate that. I'm trying here. I feel like a goofball. My beard's going to get stuck in my microphone. So if you hear me yelp, that's what it is. But Eric, Willie and I feel super fortunate that the document is the way it is, because we had a real heavy lift with the PID, and there's only 4 items, and there's only one of them that's a real gut punch to explain. But Willie, do you want to help me? You want to take a couple of the items, and I'll take a couple of them, and
Yeah, let's talk about what's actually left on the agenda, what these 4 items are, and in particular, the one that you just referenced, the gut punch. I think that's important for everybody to understand and to be familiar with.
So Willie, let's do it like this, right? I'll start with conservation equivalency. You pick whichever one you want, and then we'll do management triggers, because that's a potential gut punch. And we can do that one. We can do that one together at the end. So if any of y'all have actually read our blogs, and I look at the website stats, so I know there are a few of you. We despise the abuse of conservation equivalency, and we'll just call it CE from now on, so I don't have to say that word over and over again. CE, real easy definition, is when the commission comes down and they say, hey, we're going to put a slot limit in. These are the regulations. A state has an opportunity to come back and say, we don't like those regulations. We're going to do these regulations, send them to the technical committee, make sure they meet the 18% reduction, the 20% reduction, whatever. And there weren't a lot of guardrails on conservation equivalency, and the states that used it never met their conservation goals. And it was very upsetting to see like all these other states taking it on the chin, these massive reductions, and the same states over and over again. And it was New Jersey and Maryland. They both can harvest juvenile fish. New Jersey through their bonus tag program, which is, I mean, look, it's a farce. They only handed out 5,000 bonus tags, had 1,500 returns. Has anyone driven through New Jersey? I mean, do you see how many people live there? So you're telling me that like throughout the course of a year that only 1,500 fish were harvested via the bonus tags? Like, come on, man. So, and I've said this to the people in New Jersey, DNR, whatever it's called, and they just kind of stare back at me blankly because they know I'm right. So anyway, conservation equivalency right now, and I'm glad we started on a real positive one. This is where we can make some enormous conservation gains. We can put those guardrails on. So there's a couple of different options with conservation equivalency. All of them I love, right? One of the options says you cannot use conservation equivalency if the stock is overfished, if the stock is below target, if the stock is below threshold, sub options for each one. Fantastic. That's a great guardrail. Another guardrail that they have is they front load it with a luxury tax. So if you want to use conservation equivalency, and let's say you have to take a 20% reduction, well, you're going to have to tack on another 10 or 15 or 20% to that reduction just for the luxury of using conservation equivalency, right? And of course, there's a status quo option. But this is where, I mean, if there's one thing that I know that we did right, nobody else was talking about conservation equivalency 2.5 years ago. And we worked really hard to explain a very technical, difficult topic. The public responded awesome, 10 out of 10, knocked the leather off the ball. And they told the commission that nobody likes conservation equivalency because we all should be playing from the same deck. So there's really nothing bad except status quo. We can win this issue. This is a very winnable issue, and we can kind of make it so painful for those states that are chronic abusers of conservation equivalency, that it's going to make them think twice. The other thing, I left out one option, and I'm going to kick it over to Willie, but we always talk about the MRIP numbers and the percent standard error. MRIP is a very good program when you look at a year or multi-year coastwide harvest levels. It's pretty doggone accurate. Okay. If you say, I want to know how many fish were caught in 2 weeks in April in one state, it's not very accurate, but it's also, it's pretty transparent. So when you look at those numbers, there's a little column that says PSE, and that's percent standard error. And it's really going to rein in the ability of states to use numbers that have 50%, 60% standard error. I mean, those should not be used for management, and they currently are being used for management. So all options on the table with conservation equivalency are fantastic. We're very excited about it. And that's one where everyone can just kind of reach around and give them a little pat on the back, because thousands and thousands and thousands of comments that came in, I don't think one of them said that conservation equivalency was good. So thank you all very much for that. Willie, you want to take the next one, buddy?
Willie,
Your choice, dealer's choice.
No,
Or if
Willie,
Eric
just
has a
before you
question.
jump in, and I do want you to do that, Willie. This subject of conservation equivalency is generating some interesting, I guess, input from the chat. And folks, if you have any questions about it, don't hesitate to drop one into the Q&A box so that I can bring it to Tony and Willie's attention. You don't have to wait until the end, so to speak, for you to pipe up with questions. We actually want to make them as contextual as possible. And the fact that this is real time allows me to do that. Willie, yes, why don't you, let's continue with if you want to add anything about conservation equivalency, clearly it's a topic of interest, so go ahead, and if not, just go ahead to the second agenda item that you'd like to highlight.
Yeah, no, I think Tony did an excellent job providing an overview. And just to note, Eric, I think Lou put Tony's blog from a few days ago in the chat that really does a good, succinct job of kind of covering these in a bit more detail and just a bit more background. That when the draft amendment does come out, we'll of course be providing a lot more public comment there on all of these. And as we get into some of these, you can, as you heard from Tony, the stuff can get pretty tricky pretty quickly. But I think in the spirit of status quo is kind of the worst case. I think and another real positive outcome both of last week's meeting and potentially of this amendment is around rebuilding the stock and getting the fishery back to a good place. There was some really important forward motion there last week that stemmed off of what occurred during a couple meetings last year. And Tony, please jump in here. I know this is a complex one that has kind of multiple layers. But as Tony had mentioned, striped bass were declared overfished in 2020 and 2019. According to the ASMFC's own rules in their striped bass management plan, that stock needs to be rebuilt in 10 years, so by 2029. And the clock is ticking. Back, I guess now in 2020, the commission, ASMFC, approved Addendum 6, which set to kind of to stabilize and end overfishing. That was the main objective of that addendum. It was to reduce removals by 18% and kind of get the stock back on a trajectory toward recovery. And all signs point to the fact that it was successful. This is the measure that implemented the 28 to 35 inch slot limit, mandated circle hooks. And it appears that the commission and the anglers were successful in reducing harvest and mortality in general. Which is great, but the next step is really making sure that ending overfishing and rebuilding trajectory is going to make it within the 10 years prescribed by the fishery management plan. So a couple meetings ago, there was a motion made to include a rebuilding plan in the draft amendment. We have that there now. And so one of the options on the table here is, what assumptions do we use when it comes to rebuilding the stock? So as Tony mentioned earlier, we've had some really not great recruitment over the past several years, particularly in Chesapeake Bay. And so there are going to be a couple of options when it comes to developing a rebuilding plan that will either assume kind of business as usual when it comes to how productive the stock is in terms of recruitment. And then there's another option that really takes into account the fact that we have not had good spawning success over the past several years. And that really promotes the need to be a little bit more conservation oriented and shepherding those year classes through and giving the stock a chance to help recover itself. So certainly an option there. Again, one option is status quo, rebuild the stock using our current assumptions. The other more conservation-oriented option is to really take into account this poor recruitment that's been going on. Now, so that's one piece. This gets a little more complicated. Basically, what's going to happen is that this amendment is going to be approved, a little bit later this year. And then what will then happen is there's going to be a stock assessment that's going to come out in October of 2022. We don't know how that stock assessment is going to look. It might say the stock is on track to rebuild by 2029. I think most folks, many folks, I should say, are not particularly optimistic, again, given the fact that we have not had great recruitment over the past couple of years. So if the stock is not going to, if the stock is still experiencing overfishing and not on track to rebuild, we're going to have to take additional action. And the way that the commission is structured, that action will go through an addendum, and then we wouldn't have any implementation of that rebuilding plan until 2024. Now, that only gives us 5 years to get on track to rebuild the stock by 2029. So, Tony, I might kick it over to you just to describe what one forward-thinking commission member brought forward at last week's meeting that kind of gets around this loophole and makes it easier for us to take immediate action if we do indeed find this fall that the stock is still in bad shape.
Okay, for the sake of accuracy, my friend, I'm just going to read this off and thank God. One of the other people we work with has faster fingers than me and Willie and screenshot this because we missed it. So thank you, Will, for nailing this one down. I'm just bringing it up right now. So, okay, Commissioner Armstrong from Massachusetts, who is a really, I like the guy. He's a straight shooter. Mike, if you're listening, I don't normally say good things about commissioners, but we've had a good relationship with you. And it's just one of those people, like, I don't have to scratch my head and say, I wonder what he's thinking. He's a character, very bright guy. So he made this motion. Move to add an option to section 4.4 rebuilding plan that considers an alternative process for responding to the 2022 stock assessment as follows. If the 2022 stock assessment results indicate that Amendment 7 measures have less than a 50% probability of rebuilding the stock by 2029, and if the stock assessment indicates at least a 5% reduction in removals is needed to achieve F rebuild, the board may adjust measures to achieve F rebuild via board action. So what the hell does that mean?
Yeah, translate,
actually it's very well crafted Robert's Rules motion that actually passed by consent. And what does it mean? That means that if the straight fishing language, if the 2022 stock assessment sucks as bad as we all think it does, this motion that passed means that they can change the regulations through board action and not have to go through an addendum.
In other words, it wouldn't require the same public comment. They wouldn't have to put the proposal out. People wouldn't have to wait for people to comment. They could just take effectively emergency action.
They'll take a year off. It'll take a year off the responsiveness. Not a year's worth of meetings, but because of the way the season, the timing of the meetings, the schedule right now, the schedule of the stock assessment, the time it takes states to implement regulations. In doing this, they will have the wiggle room to be able to address the data in the 2022 stock assessment in the 2023 regulations. If they went through a formal addendum process, it wouldn't be done until 2024. And as Willie said, that would just give us 5 years to rebuild. And frankly, there's a lot of us that are incredibly worried that this is not going to be an easy rebuild. And having an extra year in there, that's a heck of a lot of forethought by Commissioner Armstrong.
I want to just jump in, Tony, because I think when most people hear us say wiggle room, generally not a good thing. When most people hear us say, without public comment, it's not necessarily a good thing. And I think this situation kind of, it merits a little bit more discussion there because, when it comes to this wiggle room, And when it comes to addressing the state of the stock, basically, this is a situation where we're being precautionary to the resource, and we're going to be as proactive as we can. And certainly, public input is part of that process. And, there will be opportunities to share thoughts with commissioners, even if there isn't a formal public comment process. What we've typically seen, though, is that public comment process and kind of that more deliberate process be drawn out in such a way that kind of the aggressive action that's needed ends up happening too late or even not happening at all. And one good example of that might be at the last meeting, where we were discussing the potential protection of some recent year classes that have been really successful. And the idea that, let's implement, a new set of recreational regulations to protect these big year classes before all those fish get harvested. And what we heard from a recent, we heard from the chief stock assessment scientist here was basically that it was too late, that we could try to do something now, but we really needed to take action just as those stocks were entering the fishery, maybe back in 2018 or so. And we didn't do that. And so it's not really going to do anything if we implement a different management measure at this point. And it just kind of underscores the need for aggressive action at the time that it's needed, and to really be precautionary to the resource, as opposed to being precautionary to the status quo, where the science really doesn't merit that.
Yeah, and Willie, I don't know if somebody put something in the chat, because I use the term wiggle room. I don't know why you jumped on that so fast, but for pinpoint clarity, it gives us another year to put the right regulations in place to rebuild the stock. And that may not seem like a long time, but when you've wasted 4 years out of a 10-year rebuilding plan, 1 year becomes incredibly valuable. So it gives us an opportunity to sit down and put the best regulations in place to rebuild this stock back to its greatness. And we're not so far behind the 8 ball as we would have been without this. And I have the same concerns. We haven't come out with a formal position on this as far as, lacking public comment, but the opportunity is there. We can still write letters. We can still make sure that y'all all have a voice. It's just not going to be a scheduled hearing, like we're used to, but you can bet our voice will be heard. And man, look, we are behind the 8 ball. And if somebody puts a motion out that gets something done a year earlier, look, I don't know how long all of y'all have been following the commission, but that doesn't happen ever. So this is actually somebody being proactive, and it is not perfect, and it is not 100% what I want. But guess what? Show me something that is. So.
In the interest of time, guys, I think we should just, if Willie, could you quickly summarize the leftover items that we haven't talked about from the agenda items from last week's meeting, and then I'd like to try and start getting some Q&A in.
Oh, you're on mute, Willie.
Yep. Sorry about that. Yeah, happy to quickly. I think Tony and I can tag team these pretty quickly. One of the first other issues on the table here is recreational release mortality. And the idea that the amount of fish that are released that are not surviving is something that this amendment is trying to address through a number of different measures. One of those is through perhaps creating seasonal closures. Now, those closures could either be for targeting or for harvest. And again, we haven't come out with with an official position on this, but we know there are lots of concerns with the targeting. With the no targeting provision, A, due to enforceability, and B, due to efficacy, because we know that a lot of striped bass are caught on not on targeted trips. So there's kind of multiple layers there, and I'm happy to get into that into the Q&A. But so seasonal closures is one aspect, because if there are less striped bass being caught, then less of them are going to die after they're released. A second one is on, I believe it's at this point been whittled down to just prohibiting the use of what's called, or permitting only the use of quote unquote non-lethal items for landing striped bass. So in other words, you can't like gaff a striped bass prior to measuring it or anything like that. So that's one option that's in there. And then the third piece is just around outreach and education, whether we need kind of stronger mandates for states to increase outreach to anglers to make sure folks know the best practices for ensuring safe release, and making sure we have as many of our fish in the water that are released back into the water surviving. And I should note here, there's also some great research going on with the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries, where they're doing some work right now comparing circle hooks to J hooks and hopefully trying to get us a better estimate of post-release mortality that we can apply to our management purposes.
Tony, you want to throw anything else in there before we get to some of the questions?
I think it should be noted that the effort controls that Willie mentioned, there's two separate effort controls. One would be no harvest, kind of in spawning areas, that kind of thing. The other is no targeting. And there's two things about no targeting. One, there's a law enforcement committee at the commission. Every time the law enforcement committee has been asked for feedback, they said that is impossible to enforce that, because as long as a bluefish or false albacore or anything else swims in the ocean, it's going to be hard to prove what you're targeting. The second thing about that is they can't quantify the conservation, meaning that because no targeting is not enforceable, the statisticians at the commission have basically said over and over again that if you drop down no targeting, we would not be able to tell you how many fish you saved. So, as a resource first association, we're all in on bringing this stock back, but you better tell us if I have to send a message to Guide saying that they can't work, we should probably understand what we're saving in the process. And as long as they can't do that, we're probably going to lean incredibly heavy on, if it comes to it, the no harvest portion. That's the only thing I wanted to throw in on that, Eric.
Okay.
And, yeah.
I mentioned earlier that there was a lot of interest in conservation equivalency. We do have a question from Jim Grammer asking for a little bit more of a high altitude explanation of what conservation equivalency is and why it's so critical, why it's plays such a critical role in fisheries management.
Eric, sorry, before we jump in, just one last issue that we kind of just touched on very briefly, but management triggers is the other issue on the table here. It's a thicket. There's a lot here, and we don't really have the time to get into the details. But I just wanted to just raise that that's another one of the big items that are on the table. And the triggers are basically what's happening in the fishery or with the resource itself that spurs management action. And with many other options, there are opportunities here to really strengthen the management triggers, for example, around recruitment and making management more responsive to poor recruitment. There are also some areas that are a bit more concerning in terms of potentially relaxing some of the requirements when we have a fishery that, where the stock has declined to an unhealthy state, or where we're harvesting too many fish, in terms of perhaps allowing there to be more time than there should be to take meaningful action for the commission. So just wanted to highlight that last issue, and I will let's get back to conservation equivalency.
Which of you wants to take this? Again, we're looking for a slightly higher altitude, sort of conceptual explanation of why it's so important to this conversation.
Willie, let me not try to help out here. Okay, so stock assessment comes out, and it says you have to take a 20% reduction. When the Striped Bass Management Board gets that report, the technical committee will most likely have come up with options to change the regulations.
Like a slot limit.
Yeah, like a slot limit. And the only tools they have in their toolbox are seasons, size, and creel. And that's it. So they'll come up with something that would achieve that 20% reduction. A state or a municipality, like Potomac Rivers Fisheries Commission, is a municipality, not a state that has a vote on the commission. They can come back and say, we want to do conservation equivalency. And
in other words, something different in the supposed interest of achieving the same goal.
Correct. And it needs to achieve that same 20% goal. However, they are using they're using some. Remember how I said that MRIP is really good on a coast-wide level, and over the course of a year, they'll start using statewide level data, and they'll start using it for shorter periods of time. And those PSEs rise. And a lot of times over time, like over the last, let's say 10 years, the states that have opted for conservation equivalency in some form or another have not met their conservation goals. Because, if you put crummy numbers in, you get crummy stuff out.
So in principle, conservation equivalency isn't necessarily bad, but the practice, it sounds to me, based on what you're saying, has amounted to gaming the system. Is that fair?
That is 100% accurate and fair. It's used with other species, and it doesn't have the same problems.
Okay. Another question here from John Papsiak. He asks, so what happened to the 2011s? Was there ever an official explanation? Seems like there's a serious lesson learned there as it relates to any decent future year classes we might see.
Will, you want me to get that? Okay. So,
you go for it.
So yeah, when that, John, great to hear from you. Awesome question. When that stock assessment came out in 2017, they have like a little frequency chart, and being the fourth best year class on record, we should have seen them at a much higher frequency. Recruiting to the SSB never happened. I could tell you where they went, and that's onto the dinner plates of Marylanders and on the decks of their boats, because it was a madhouse here. There were stripers everywhere. The fishing was incredible, and the effort went through the roof. There is no accountability at the commission as far as, if I overfish striped bass, I do not have a payback the next year. If I overfish, my quota is not cut for the next year. And it went on for several years. When those fish recruited fully to our size limit in 2015, they took a shellacking, and that's why they didn't recruit. And I wish there was a payback. How we know each other. You know how hard we slug away for this. But I think the other lesson, John, you had mentioned the other. Are we going to learn this lesson moving forward? Clearly, we didn't learn it with the 2015s, which were the 8th best year class on record. When that motion was asked to be put into the amendment to protect the 2015s, and the lead stock assessment scientist come back and says it's too late, boy, that was our last great shot, man. The 2015s were a good year class, and the fact that we waited too long and didn't think about that, like you said, we should have learned our lesson in 2011. You're right.
And maybe this is a good question to weave in based on what you just said, Tony. Can you talk about the stock assessment process and why it seems to take so long, even in a non-COVID environment, to get the data?
I am happy to give it a shot. I am not a stock assessment scientist. Folks who know stock assessment scientists know they are often a different animal in terms of their incredible statistical ability. Stock assessments are a complicated process. There is a lot of information that goes into each one. If you take a look at the full stock assessment, the last one that came out, I forget how many pages it is, but it is in the many hundreds.
These are 1,200. It was 1,286 pages.
And the short answer is that the models that are developed, they are very challenging to develop. B, they integrate an enormous amount of data in terms of, again, looking at spawning success of fisheries, trying to estimate recreational catch and effort, which, as folks know, that information operates on a lag as well. Commercial landings, there's a lot of information that has to get integrated into these models. It has to go through the peer review process, which is a really important and critical element of stock assessments. We know that, basically does it have the necessary scientific merit to be used in management decisions. So there's kind of the short answer is that there is just a huge amount of information, and it is a monumental effort to get these assessments completed. It's also worth mentioning that there are two different types of assessments. There are what are called benchmark assessments, which may kind of change the models or the approach that's being used in the process itself. And then there's also what's called a management track or stock assessment update, which is more of kind of a turn of the crank. So you're not changing the model or the approach from the last time, but you're incorporating several new years of data. And those take less time, but it still takes time to put those together. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
There's a couple of questions here that I'm going to try and weave together. They have to do with sort of, I guess, keeping the individual states honest. The participants want to know, is there anything that exists in the way of incentives to ensure that the individual states or municipalities or members, if you will, of the SMFC are actually dedicating the appropriate resources and then enforcing the agreed upon regulations? And is there a way of knowing how those members are actually discharging their responsibilities or gauging the degree to which they're doing it well or poorly?
Well, okay. Commissioners aren't paid. It's not a, if you're on the council, one of the fisheries councils, there is compensation for that, because it's a massive amount of information that you have to know and be prepared for these meetings. And who the heck can afford to take 3 or 4 days off in a row, and then more days to prep? The commission, believe it or not, the commissioners are not paid to be on the commission. So man, holding an individual so I guess my point is why else would you be there, right? It would be to represent your own interests. If you're whatever you do, if you're us, or if you're a commercial fisherman, or if you're a squid boat guy, they're representing their own interests, because that's really the only reason why anyone in their right mind would be a commissioner. There's really not a lot of, it's not like it's fun. I can promise you that. Does that make sense, Eric? Did I answer that question?
Well, is there a way of, so given what you just said, are there any options to incentivize
get involved,
to not do, for example, what you've told us New Jersey and Maryland are doing?
Yeah.
And is there a way to monitor? You guys do this obviously, but is there a way for people who are interested? Pete from Connecticut, wants to know how can I hold my own state commissioners accountable?
Well, you got a good one in Dr. Justin Davis. He's the fisheries director in Connecticut, and he's a brilliant scientist, and he is conservation minded. And we've kind of thought of coming out with like a League of Conservation Voters-esque, commissioners kind of thing, and how the commissioners vote. But the problem is the states only come out with one vote, and there's 3 commissioners. So you never really know in that caucus. It's just out of those 3 people, 2 out of 3 have to vote a certain way. So it's really hard to know how the individuals vote, but you can certainly see how the states vote. As far as holding them accountable, man, send them an email, start a relationship with them, volunteer for an advisory panel. There are always spots open for advisory panels, and that's how you get known on the commission and participate in the process. And let me tell you something, like, you do that for a couple of years, and you put your name on a list to be, considered as a commissioner when somebody turns out. That's how you win this. We have lost that game. Conservationists have lost that game, and that is a lot of the reason why we're in the position that we're in. There is not a strong voice of conservation on the commission.
Tony and Willie, we're going to wrap up momentarily, but I want to try and squeeze in one other question, because I think it does reflect, what people out there might be thinking, given the somewhat gloomy assessment that sort of has encapsulated your commentary. Are we headed toward a moratorium? Is that inevitably where this is going to have to go? If the striper stocks are to recover to a self-sustaining level?
I think Willie wants me to answer that. He's just Willie is sending me.
I'm happy to answer. I feel like you want to answer, Tony, but I
Yeah.
happily take it if you like.
So Willie, I'll tell you what. I will answer because I cannot give a formal answer as the Guides Association because I haven't seen the stock assessment yet. And here's
Fair.
the answer
Okay, good.
here's the answer that's in my heart right now today, without me seeing that stock assessment today, this moment. These are resilient fish, like resilient, like you can't believe. You think about a striper, right? This is not a this is a tough fish that can live in a wide variety of places, is not picky about what it eats, and they're broadcast spawners, so it's almost like you just need the right place, right time, just once, and then like boom. Yes, I think they can come back. No, I do not think today we're at a moratorium. I also do not think the stock assessment is going to be very bright. So we're going to have to make some pretty hard decisions come October, but that doesn't take anything away from the fight that we're in now and the need for public comment and to make sure that these things come out of Amendment 7, put these fish on the right track. And we're just going to take one fight at a time. And the fight now is what's in Amendment 7. And that may completely do a 180 come October when we see that assessment. But, it's a tough place to be in, like doing this kind of work, because we live and die by science, right? Not what's in your heart. It doesn't, believe me, there's plenty of fight in our heart, but like what my gut says doesn't matter. It's what's in black and white and what we can accomplish. So right now, no. In October, maybe.
Hey, Tony, can you talk about how important it was that we had such a great response and how the board felt about everything, people writing letters, making comments, calling in? I mean, I'm sure that had a huge influence in the hearings last week.
It's the only thing that saved us. Like, don't even kid yourself. If we talked with a couple other groups that were sending letters in. We ran the full numbers. ASMFC came out with a report from the public information document. You're talking about thousands and thousands of emails and letters, and like something in the neighborhood of 99, either 97 to 99% were all for conservation of all those that came in. And that's our community. We love these things. They're not the strongest, they're not the fastest, they're not the prettiest, but like, God, there's something about them. People get passionate about striped bass, and like, once more into the breach, dear friends, we need you one more time in the next couple of months, and then just leave it all on the field. Leave it all out there, and no matter what happens, at least you can look in the mirror and said, well, I tried, I did the best I could with what I had. And I guess that's my message to everyone. Just do it one more time.
I think that,
but then I might actually be on here in a couple of months right after the October assessment, and I might tell you to do it one more time again. But that's just part of the game.
We'll be telling our viewers to definitely, get out the word and write. Lou?
no, so go ahead, Willie. I know Willie has something to add here too. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a couple quick things just to Tony's, just to add on to what Tony said. I think if you look at, the numbers, right, and again, our current stock assessment is based on data through 2017. That's 5 years old. So where we are right now is not necessarily where we were 5 years ago. But look, compare that with the 1980s, and we at least were in a different place. We're not there yet. Hopefully the trajectory that we see in a few months is also that we're not there yet. We can't really say beyond that, but I do, one thing that's so challenging about fisheries is that there's kind of this tendency to always be reactive, right? You're always reacting to what's going on, and you're always in a crisis that you're trying to prevent. And certainly right now we're not in a great place, but this is aggressive action now can really help avoid much more aggressive and damaging action later on. And that's really what we're pushing for, recognizing that we don't have all the information yet, but where we can be more proactive and address concerns as they're emerging rather than as they've completely matured and become a huge issue. That's going to be a benefit, certainly with striped bass, but certainly also more broadly than that And that's something that certainly ASGA tries to promote in all of the fisheries that we work in. And I also, Eric, I know there are several questions left in the queue that we weren't able to get to tonight. But we have kind of an exciting new initiative going on at ASGA with the Guidepost, our podcast. I'm going to let Tony explain that a bit, because I know he loves the podcast. He certainly has a face made for radio, so I know he's really enjoyed having that opportunity. So Tony, why don't you tell folks a bit about the Guidepost challenge?
Yeah, so we're so sorry that we kind of like ran out of time. I wasn't able to see all the questions in the chat, but we love the guys over here at Masters on the Fly, and we'll just extend our promo to this. If anyone has any questions that weren't answered, you can send them to comments at saltwaterguidesassociation.org. Again, that's comments at saltwaterguidesassociation.org. And if we read it on the podcast, Costa is our big sponsor for the Guidepost, and you will get a little prize from Costa when and if we do answer your question on the podcast. So sorry about not getting to all of them, but we'll do our best. We'll answer them anyway if they're not on the podcast. We'll email you back. We care about what y'all think. So
That's awesome.
I just wanted to add that, what you just said, Tony, is exactly what everybody should do. If they are interested in the subject matter, and they clearly are, and they had questions that weren't answered, or inevitably they'll have questions in the future, they need to engage with ASGA and contribute. They can obviously contribute financially, but they can contribute in many other ways as well. Seeker guidance on how to communicate with commissioners, make their voice heard, and try to help both of you and John and everybody else who's participating here achieve the collective goal.
Yep. Thank you guys. I'd just like to add that in the chat, you'll see the Guidepost challenges right in the chat. So please, copy that to your browser so you can see it. Willie, Tony, Eric, thank you so very much. This has been an incredible evening, incredible information. Disseminating all this stuff is very complicated. Being able to explain it to the rest of us out here who are not quite as smart as you guys is very, very helpful. So I'd like to thank you on behalf of Masters of the Fly. Lou?
Yeah, no, thank you all. And, I think my big takeaways, and Tony and I had a conversation just before this the other day, and Tony, I know is, you've seen more of this battle than any of us have. It was the first time I heard you actually optimistic coming out of the ASMFC about, some of the progress that we've made. And ASCA has been a huge leader in driving the response to the last stock assessment. We've obviously got a lot we got to do and figure out once we get past the October assessment. But I do want to let people know that thanks to ASCA and thanks to everyone's contributions here, we do feel like we're making progress here. This is not, slamming our head against a brick wall. And one thing that both Tony and Willie said that was really important, and we said it tonight, but I want to reemphasize it, is everyone's contributions here, the responses to the PID, the letters, the emails, the calls to representatives and to everyone else involved made an enormous difference. And so everyone on this call and the broader community had a huge role in the incremental progress that we've made, and we're going to need everyone leaning in further as we try to drive this agenda forward. But there's a hopeful horizon here if we can all kind of lean into this. And thank you, Tony and Willie, for all your leadership. You guys are incredible, and we are really thankful as fishermen for everything that you've done for us.
We are.
Thank you. Thank you for the time and and access to your community, Lou. It's a bunch of great people. And I'm sorry for interrupting you, David, but just wanted to get that in before we cut it off.
Well, thank you, Lou, too. And again, guys, we really want to thank ASCA for being part of this. Eric, taking us through this and moderating has been phenomenal. I would just like to do a little shameless promotion for Masters of the Fly. We have these wonderful little stickers. Not doing it justice. It looks like this thing up here in the corner that you can get if you write us a letter or email us. We'll send it to you. You can stick it on the back of your car in your stripping basket. You can put it on your computer. You can stick it anywhere. Give it to your kids, your relatives. Additionally, I just want to tell you guys everything really quick. February 6th, Bob Popovics. The 27th of February, we're going to have Chris Wood, who's the head of Trout Unlimited. We are going to have Jason Taylor on March 6th. We're going to have women leaders in fly fishing, March 20th. James Prosek, April 3rd. And finally, on May 1st, we're going to have a guides roundtable, and we'll be wrapping up last year and talking about the upcoming year. And I'm sure you guys at ASCA, we will have disseminated more information so that we can talk about our hopes for the future, as far as the guides go. So again, that's what we're doing.
Thanks, all of you. Great evening, and we'll see all of you next Sunday night. And thanks to the ASCA folks for all the great work. Have a good one.
Thank you.